So in September 2024, Donald Trump stood in front of a crowd and said something that a lot of people believed. He said,
"A tariff is a tax on a foreign country. That's the way it is, whether you like it or not."
"A tariff is a tax on a foreign country. That's the way it is, whether you like it or not. A lot of people like to say it's a tax on us. No. It's a tax on a foreign country." And then in 2025, his administration imposed the largest tariffs in over 100 years. The average tariff rate on U.S. imports went from 2.6% to 13% over the course of the year. So I want to look at what actually happened. Not what anyone said would happen, what the data shows actually happened. Okay, so first, let's understand what a tariff actually is and why governments use them. A tariff is a tax that the government puts on imported goods. So if China ships $100 worth of steel into the US and there's a 25% tariff on steel, the American company importing that steel pays $25 to the US government on top of the purchase price. The idea behind tariffs has always been to protect domestic industries. If Chinese steel is cheaper than American steel companies struggle to compete. A tariff makes the imported steel more expensive, which levels the playing field and gives American manufacturers a chance. That's the theory. And there's a version of it that makes genuine economic sense. The argument Trump made was slightly different. He argued that tariffs are paid by the foreign country, by China, not by Americans, that China was essentially sending money to the US Treasury. And this is where the economics gets important, because whether that's true or not determines who actually pays. Here is how it actually works in practice. When the US puts a 25% tariff on Chinese steel, a Chinese steel company doesn't write a check to the US government. The American importer who buys that steel does. They pay the tariff at the border when the goods arrive. So the question then becomes, does that American importer absorb the cost themselves and take lower profits? Or do they pass it on to their customers by raising prices? The answer, according to essentially every major economic study done on this, is that most of it gets passed on to American consumers. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York published a study in February 2026 looking at who paid Trump's 2025 tariffs. Their finding was this: nearly 90% of the economic burden of the tariffs fell on American companies and consumers. Through August 2025, the pass-through rate was 94%. The Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank that generally supports free markets, published their own research finding pass-through rates of 81% during the 2018 to 2019 tariffs and 92% during the 2025 tariffs. The Tax Foundation, the same independent organization we referenced in our inflation video, calculated that Trump's tariffs equated to a tax increase of $1,000 per American household in 2025, and households were expected to pay an additional $1,300 in 2026. The Tax Foundation also called this the largest U.S. tax increase since 1993. So when Trump said it wasn't going to be a cost to Americans, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the Cato Institute, and the Tax Foundation all found the opposite. Here's the moment that kind of said it all. In May 2025, Walmart, the largest retailer in the United States, said publicly that it may have to raise prices in response to the tariffs on Chinese goods. Trump's response on social media was to tell Walmart they should eat the tariffs and not charge customers anything. Think about what that implies. If China was paying the tariffs, if the cost was falling on the foreign country as Trump claimed, there would be nothing for Walmart to eat. Walmart would have nothing to pass on to customers because China would already have absorbed the cost. The fact that Trump had to tell Walmart not to raise prices is itself an acknowledgement that the cost was sitting with American businesses, not with China. The Yale Budget Lab tracked the economic effects of the 2025 tariffs in real time. Before 2025, the U.S. was collecting about $7.6 billion a month in customs duty revenues. The 2025 tariffs raised roughly $214.7 billion in additional revenue above that baseline over the course of the year. For consumer goods, specifically the average tariff rate on imported core goods went from 2.7% before 2025 to 13.1% by mid-2025. And what happened to prices? PCE core goods prices, which measures what American consumers actually pay for physical products, rose 1.5% in the first 6 months of 2025. In the same period in 2024, they rose just 0.3%. The Budget Lab found that when looking at furniture and household equipment prices, a category particularly exposed to tariffs, U.S. prices were 3% higher than their 2024 average by July 2025. In comparable economies that weren't imposing tariffs on the same goods, the increase was between 0.5% higher and more than 1% lower. So U.S. prices on tariff-exposed goods went up significantly more than in countries that didn't impose tariffs, which is exactly what you'd expect if American consumers were absorbing the cost. The argument for tariffs isn't just about revenue. It's also about protecting American jobs, bringing manufacturing back, making the U.S. less dependent on China. And this is where the picture gets genuinely more complicated. The Richmond Fed looked at what happened to employment during the 2018 to 2019 tariffs. They found that while tariffs boosted employment in specific protected industries, like steel and aluminum, they caused a relative employment decline of about 1.8% in industries that relied on imported inputs. That's equivalent to roughly 220,000 jobs lost in industries that use the now more expensive imported materials to make their own products. When you factor in China's retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports, because China responded by putting their own tariffs on American goods, a 2024 working paper estimates the total employment reduction rises to about 320,000 jobs. And the share of Chinese goods in U.S. imports did fall significantly, from 22% at the end of 2017 to about 12% at the end of 2024. But a lot of that trade didn't come back to the U.S. It shifted to Vietnam, Mexico, India, and other countries. The manufacturing didn't necessarily come home. It just moved somewhere else. Here's what I think is the most important thing to understand about tariffs. They are a legitimate economic tool. There are genuine arguments for using them: protecting strategic industries, reducing dependence on adversarial countries, negotiating leverage in trade deals. Economists debate this seriously, and there are real cases where tariffs make sense. But the specific claim that was made repeatedly, that tariffs are paid by China and not by Americans, is not supported by the evidence. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York found 90% of the burden fell on American companies and consumers. The Tax Foundation called it the largest tax increase since 1993. Yale's Budget Lab tracked the price increases in real time. What tariffs actually are, in practice, is a consumption tax. You pay it every time you buy a product that uses imported components or materials. It doesn't show up on your receipt as a line item. It's embedded in the price of the thing you're buying, which makes it, in the words of Milton Friedman, taxation without legislation. Except in this case, it was with legislation, just without transparency about who was actually paying. Trump said China was paying the tariffs. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York said 90% of it was paid by Americans. The Tax Foundation called it the largest tax increase since 1993. And when Walmart said it might raise prices, Trump told them to eat the cost, which only makes sense if the cost was sitting with American businesses all along. The debate about whether tariffs are good policy is real and ongoing. Smart economists disagree on it, but the debate about who pays them, that one the data has pretty clearly answered.